Okay, so I'm really sorry I didn't start to film any of this repair because I've just been so busy this weekend. I just wanted to crack on and do it. But I'm sort of halfway through it now and thought, do you know what? This might be really useful to some people who've got a similar problem. So I'm working on the air suspension. The air suspension, which is at the back on the F11, not the Range Rover. So airbags on the two rear shocks on the BMW F11. It's on the deck, you know, it won't pump up, and it's not giving me any error codes either. Originally it gave me a drive height error, and then it stopped giving me any errors, and the car is visibly like a race car. It's low as slammed to the deck. So I've taken the compressor out, and let me just show you it's in pieces now. I've just been inspecting visually what's wrong with it. Okay, so when I say low, I mean low. It's ridiculously low. I mean, look at that. I mean, it's not funny. When you're right here, you can't even see the top of the tyre. It's so low now. But that's because I've disconnected the compressor. It was probably about that much higher because there was actually air being held at pressure in the bags. I know this because the compressor, which lives just underneath the back here, when I disconnected it, as in when I disconnected the air lines, quite a lot of pressure relieved from the tubing, so I knew that both bags were holding reasonable pressure. They weren't just completely empty. Okay, now the reason the air suspension stopped giving me faults is traced back to, if we look at which fuses relate to the air suspension, 152 and 182. 182 was in there, and I think I've lost the fuse now, but I pulled it out and it was blown. And now 182, let me just show you, is a 40 amp fuse. For a 40 amp fuse to blow, there's got to be something wrong. So I was going to take the compressor out anyway, and now I'm even more intrigued to see what could cause a 40 amp fuse to blow in my air compressor. So let's go and have a look. So the evidence that I had at that point was that both bags were holding some kind of pressure. They weren't completely down. Before, when I got my first error, only one side was down, and then the other side about a day or two later. For both bags to fail just seems unlikely. The valve block, which both of the tubes go into, that's a possibility that could have an issue. I've taken that apart and had a quick look at it. Visually it looks all right, but obviously that means nothing really. But that's why I've taken the rest of the compressor apart, just to have a look at the internals. Maybe that's what the problem is. Something central seems to be the issue with the compressor unit rather than anything else. But let's see how it goes. So this is my compressor in pieces. I do apologise that I didn't film the beginning, but hey, I just got going with it. So this part here, this is the whole assembly. This is the top of the piston. This is the electric motor. So this spins, this piston goes up and down like that, and that bolts on to the head here, which is what receives this piston ring just here. Okay. Now this here is the solenoid that controls the venting. So this solenoid here sits on that part here, this way around like that, and as you can see, there's a fair bit of corrosion going on there. I can't really test. I haven't got a 12 volt power supply to hand, and I've got a spare battery, so for the minute I'm just going to visually see what I can do. So the reason I thought I'd start filming was this part here, which all sits together, is actually the compressor part. So obviously this part here is pumping up and down into this part of the head, and the compressed air is forced through this chamber here, which is usually full of desiccant beads. Now this is the dryer, so this has to dry the moist air that's been pulled in from outside. And because I'm just having a sort of a visual look, this has been dried, by the way. Now I've just bung this in the microwave for about 1 minute. It was a far different colour to this before, and it was soaking wet. And you can probably still see these are the little felt filters that sit at either end. If I squeeze it now, I don't know, it doesn't look quite as wet because it's been drying on this bit of kitchen towel. But these were soaking wet. So, you see that? Still a bit wet now. So I'm just going to dry these out completely. The beads are now pretty dry. And I'm going to try and put it all back. But literally, yeah, I had to mop out the inside of this. It was that wet. So that is not going to help your compressor do its job at all. So I'm going to try that and I'm going to shove it all back in. And maybe I'll film a bit of that if I get a chance. And we'll just see if it works again. Right, so I'm going to reassemble everything now. Here's our compressor housing. I don't know if you can see into the end there. This is where we're going to tip all of the desiccant. But first of all, it needs one of these, not that one. It needs one of these filters that's going to sit. It's just a little sort of fabric-y filter that sits at the bottom. It's going to sit in there. We're going to tip all the desiccant in. Then we're going to put the top pieces back on and bolt it all back together. I don't know if you can quite see down the end. The way the air escapes is through this little connection here, which is where the, I don't know if you can see, this tube here screws onto the back of that, and that's where our air is supplied from to pump up the suspension. So let's put this guy back in now that he's nice and dry. Push him all the way in there nice and securely into the bottom. Just use one of these bolts to help me. Make sure he's in the right place. There we go. To get our desiccant beads, which are now a sort of nice grey whitey sort of colour, whereas they were a dark brown yellowish sort of colour when they were soaking wet. So let's see if we can tip this all in here. Oh, look at that. Okay. Now then, this little fabric filter sits on top to hold them there. There we go. And then that sits on top like that. This just pushes on and holds it down like that. This doesn't look so good, but I don't want to start messing with this just at the moment. I don't know if it's actually going to cause us a problem just yet. And then this spring, it's spring loaded. It holds it all on like that. So just hope that doesn't fall. With the right bit on. Ready to screw them up as well. Okay. Right, that's that part put back together. Now let's assemble this back on here. There we go. So just locate the piston correctly into the compressor head. Now we need to make sure the air line is actually connected, else nothing's going to happen. I'm just going to turn it my way, make it easier. Okay, now we're going to put the compressor back in the car and see if it works. It stands to reason this could be the problem. With a saturated desiccant dryer chamber, you know, it was sopping wet. The outlet, the aperture is ever so tiny. It's like 1 millimeter, if that, for the outlet at the back of the desiccant dryer to the airbags. So if the dryer part is saturated in water and it's blocking and you really can't force it through, that suggests to me that the pump could overload, a little bit like if you put your hand over the end of a vacuum cleaner, you hear the motor go as it tries really hard for the motor to go. That could be what caused the surge in power, which what blew the fuse perhaps. That could be all it is, just a wet compressor. This fix cost me nothing but a bit of time, and I bought a couple of fuses, 40 amp fuses, £1.80 I think it was. So I've already got the fuse, shoved the fuse in. Let's go and put the compressor back on and see what happens. Okay, in typical British fashion, it's been raining again. As you can see, the compressor is now installed, and it happened rather quickly. As soon as I opened the door, the car kicked in and the compressor worked, and we now have the correct ride height. So I didn't catch it on video, unfortunately, when the compressor kicked in and started working, but we've got level, pumped up rear suspension, and I believe that is fixed. Excellent. There we go. Job's a good one. So there we go. Your air suspension doesn't have to be a nightmare. The compressors are expensive. You don't want to replace it unless you really have to. And I think they're pretty robust as well, really. The only things to think about are water, if the beads are saturated, and wear. Maybe the piston ring might be the kind of thing you want to have a look at. And I did when I took it out, but it was fine. Apart from that, I don't think there's any major things you should worry about your compressor, and you shouldn't go spending 300, 400, 500 quid buying a new one until you investigate what's wrong with the one you've got. Anyway, see you later.